Hello and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, the director. I'm delighted today to welcome back as a Westminster speaker, one of our very best who's been absent for far too long. I speak of Hassan Mneimneh, who is principal at Middle East Alternatives in Washington, D.C. He's a scholar at the Middle East Institute and contributing editor at Fikra Forum at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. By the way, you can subscribe to Fikra Forum complimentarily, and I encourage your reading of this publication because it contains some of the most incisive analyses of the Middle East, and of what it publishes, I find Hassan Mneimneh's the most penetrating analyses. So I pass that on for your consideration. Hassan was previously Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Director of the Center for Global Engagement at the Institute for American Values. More pertinently, for the subject which Hassan is going to be addressing us on today, is his considerable experience in Iraq. Between 1999 and 2008, Hassan Mneimneh assumed leading functions at the Iraq Memory Foundation, the Iraq Foundation, and the Iraq Research and Documentation Project. I will only add from my own perspective that he greatly contributed to the production of a documentary series of the victims of Saddam Hussein's regime and helped fashion a 1-hour television show that became the second most popular in Iraq on al-Iraqi television, particularly during the Ramadan period, which of course is when in the Muslim world, television gets its highest viewership. This was a singular accomplishment. Now, Hassan Mneimneh specializes in the affairs of the Middle East, North Africa, and the wider world, with a particular emphasis on radicalism and factionalism. He's written in English, Arabic, and French on political, cultural, historical, and intellectual questions concerning the Arab and Muslim worlds. He will now address us on the subject of Iraq, past, present, and pivotal future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for your kind words. And really, it's an honor and a privilege for me to be associated with the Westminster Institute for this presentation, but also in particular with you, having been what you have been in terms of supporting American values, universal values, through your diligent work on helping Iraqis rebuild their information operation, in particular after the fall of the dictatorial regime. Indeed, what I'm going to be talking about today is Iraq as it stands, Iraq as it was, and Iraq as it could be. It's Iraq past, present, and pivotal future. What I would propose to you is the following, is that the rise of the new Iraq is naturally conditioned on its ability to successfully face its economic, administrative, and geostrategic challenges, but also, maybe even more importantly, to address, manage, and reform its political culture, its historical legacy, its religious heritage, its national identity, and its place in the world. While the immediate paramount importance of concrete concerns, safety, livelihood, employment, health, education, environment, food security, water security, and other issues, other salient issues that impose themselves cannot be questioned, a new Iraq will succumb to the recurrent and incessant hard challenges that it faces if it does not achieve cultural security. The problematic faced by Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the new Prime Minister of Iraq, in many ways, a paradigm shift in being the Prime Minister of Iraq, is evidently structural. He has to face all the structural issues that are listed and many more, but it's also culture. I'll start by addressing the present. I'll move to the past and then to the future. What I would evidently, talking about Iraq, we have to talk about the economy of Iraq. This is the major problem that it's facing today. What we have to admit is that 17 years after the fall of the dictatorship, we have to say that Iraq as a viable economy has been a failure. This is a hard admission on the part of the Iraqis in particular, but it is a necessary one. Iraq, in the course of the past close to 2 decades, has continued to rely on a rentier state model. It has one commodity that it sells, oil, and not even refined oil. And on the basis of the revenue of that commodity, it tries to manage internally. Well, it has not managed it well. The problem we're facing here, even in terms of the economy, a problem of false nostalgia. You do have people in Iraq saying the current state of affairs, which is so bad, has to be compared and contrasted with the industrial advancements that Iraq had witnessed in the decades under dictatorship, 70s, but mostly in the 80s and even in the 90s under harsh sanctions. Claiming even that the autarky that Iraq tried to reach was basically an indication that maybe dictatorship is the way to go. We hear, unfortunately, such voices on social media repeatedly. There's a glorification of the dictator. There's a glorification of the period that was. The problem with this vision, in addition to it basically misrepresenting the advancement that Iraq had made in the 80s and to a certain extent in the 90s by being ones by the dictatorship instead of being ones despite the dictatorship, it also ignores the fact that these advancements all were set in the context of the regime priorities. The regime priorities were survival. So any advancement that Iraq was able to achieve, the regime was willing to let go instantly in order for it to survive. This is why actually the sanctions that were imposed in Iraq need to be reviewed and revised, because in more ways than one, to sanction a dictatorial regime is to invite that regime to even be more in its imposition, in its basically passing the sanctions on its audience to try to lose, but make the society lose more. In any case, so that is in need of review, but we have to understand that any advancement that was in the course of those 2 decades were for the survival of the regime, for militarism, clearly, because any so-called scientific advancement was solely for the purpose of more weapons, more tools of war, etc., including weapons of mass destruction, including basically pursuits that ended up being beyond wasteful, actually inviting the world community to step in. And the third element of the previous period was cronyism, survival militarism, and also cronyism, in the course of which only people close to the regime were able to really benefit. So we cannot, I mean, the talk about the previous model is not one to be emulated, but the current model clearly is one that did not work. It did not work because it was a problem mainly of a reliance on the rentier state model, basically that one commodity, but also an abuse of governance. One can point actually to Iraq as suffering in the course of the past decade and a half of deep corruption, but beyond corruption, we're talking about kleptocracy. Corruption is when you try to basically move around the system in order, for example, whether through contracting or whether through extracting undue fees and funds from the public, you try to enrich yourself. But the kleptocratic system in Iraq was such that basically, by following the rules, the established rules, you can basically enrich yourself as a member of the political elite. And this is exactly what happened. So Iraq suffered and still suffers. The current prime minister has basically announced that his order of business number one is to try to dismantle this huge edifice of kleptocracy that there is, but this edifice is there today. We have to admit it. This is why basically Iraq, despite the fact of it being objectively a very rich country, is in effective bankruptcy, because the kleptocratic system effectively, if we use here the model of a cow, sustainable corruption, sustainable kleptocracy is one that basically milks the cow for its own advantage. Well, Iraq went from a situation in which that cow was milked into a situation where the cow was being bled for the advantage of the political class, all the way to the cow being slaughtered for the advantage of this class, which is clearly an untenable model, and this is where we have it now crashing. It is not at all kind of the chances, the possibility of Iraq lifting itself from this mess is not very high, but this is exactly the challenge that is facing the Prime Minister today. So if it was simply a question of an economic model that is extremely short-sighted, one of a rentier state, a governance model that is thoroughly unsustainable, one of kleptocracy and beyond milking into bleeding and slaughtering the cow, which is the nation here, or at least the nation's resources. If these were the only two challenges, one would have said that these are very difficult challenges, and I do not envy any attempt at trying to rescue the nation from them. Unfortunately, there are only half of the major challenges that face Iraq today. The other two being evidently terrorism and Iranian hegemony. Terrorism is here again, I mean, the tendency today in Iraqi social media is to try to dismiss terrorism as an artifact of foreign intervention. It is the US that funds ISIS, presumably, and all sorts of other mythologies that are in circulation. The fact is, I mean, and here I'll get to talk a little bit more about it later on, but it's important to underline terrorism is both an Iraqi local production and a primary Iraqi export, other than oil, I guess, and this is not someone to be bragging about. This is not, I'm talking here about the local production and the global exchange. Because yeah, I mean, Iraq did import, for example, from Saudi Arabia, the rigidity of the Salafi school of Islamic thought that it ultimately the terrorists in Iraq were able to expand on and make of it the extremely harsh jihadism that they promote. But actually, the Islamic State as a global phenomenon is to a large extent an Iraqi-centered Islamic State. And this is something that I think is important for Iraqis to face down the line. The other side of the equation, because here terrorism, which is largely Sunni terrorism, Sunni Islamist terrorism, has to be basically underlined that it comes with as a counterweight or a counterbalance in terms of the horrors that Iraq faces with Iranian hegemony. Here, what we're talking about, the overwhelming weight of Iranian penetration in Iraqi society will remain to be assessed, but there's no question about it that it is extremely difficult for Iraqis to proceed without finding a way to, if not completely excise this influence, this penetration, at least to reduce it to a manageable level. And this is, again, actually, in terms of the current prime minister keeps on underlining his intent to do it. Whether he's going to be able or not is really questionable, given that that Iran ultimately accepted his ascent to the prime ministership for maybe as a concession on their part in recognition of their the state of their influence in Iraq, given the success of the American policy of engaging Iran in a stranglehold, in an economic warfare to force it to change behavior, but also, and another reason that Iran might have tolerated the choice of Mustafa al-Kadhimi as prime minister is because it knows it has enough assets positioned in the country to be able to sabotage whatever he tries to engage in. And therefore, we should have no illusion that the intent of Kadhimi to simply restore Iraqi sovereignty and Iraqi independence effectively is going to be an easy one, if at all. These four major challenges are like the impossible, or at least the extremely difficult set of challenges that face Iraq today. An economic model that does not work, a governance model that needs to be scrapped because it's based on the theft of public resources through a kleptocratic arrangement, terrorism, which, despite the fact that it has been curtailed, but we know well that what has been successful so far is being able to basically defeat them tactically and not necessarily in a strategic final way. And finally, and actually probably one of the as important as the three together, is the Iranian heavy, overwhelming weight in Iraq. That said, so these are the problems, and if it were just for this, I would submit to you, these are the problems of today. Iraq faces basically an existential problematic. But I would add to this and actually make it almost as prerequisite to be able to succeed in facing those challenges beyond the immediate, beyond the temporary, the need to reconceive Iraq. This is like here, it's not theoretical. This is not about culture as a high commodity. This is about everyday life. What I would suggest to you is the following. To a large extent, Iraq over the past many decades has not suffered from a decline as much from an induced one, a forced one, therefore let's call it a declination. Meaning it did not decline as a result of conditions that are random or conditions that are external to it. There has been really an effort at forcing Iraq to decline. Now it is very kind of convenient for well-meaning Iraqis, well-meaning people in the Middle East, but also people with ideological agendas to agree with that statement right away and point the finger to the party that is presumably responsible. Call it colonialism, neo-colonialism, imperialism, neo-imperialism. That is an outside party. Well, I would suggest, and this is something I'm glad to say, that many in the region are engaged in actually a similar way of looking at the question. This is without denying that external elements influence, external elements push, enhance a direction or another. But the primary problem that has been faced by Iraq and by the region, Iraq here really as almost like an archetype for the region, has been not colonialism, not the outside, but reductionism, the inside. What we have faced in the course of the past century is a work in progress, which is the appropriation of modernity. The region, in its self-awareness, in its self-definition, and Iraq, once again, is kind of a leading model, a leading example in that, has basically had an incomplete and unachieved, actually a partial appropriation of modernity. And as a result, the effects of reductionism on political culture have been devastating. What I'll submit to you is the following. What we have is the notion of unity. Unity across the board, the many ideologies that ended up successively dominating the narrative in Iraq and dominating therefore politics in Iraq and leadership in Iraq and across the region insisted on unity. But unity here was perceived as normative uniformity. In order for unity to be achieved, there needed to be sort of an eradication of difference rather than an embrace of difference as well. So the individual was subsumed into the nation. I mean, the individual is just an atom, a representative of the whole, which is the nation. So instead of the focus being on the citizen, the focus, for example, became on the nation. How we define the nation here, where we have had a number of iterations, a number of different characterizations, but nonetheless, in these different characterizations, the individual was always viewed as basically a pawn or a unit in unity. And therefore, the focus is on the nation. But then, as a result of this reductionism, the party gets its, the nation itself gets subsumed or gets to be represented by the party. And therefore, it's no longer about the nation, it's about the party that embodies the nation. And as a further stage of reductionism, the party itself gets reduced, gets subsumed in the figure of the leader. So the leader embodies the party, that embodies the nation, that represents the individual, and the individual is lost. And it becomes a matter, sort of the measure of success, the measure of progress, the measure of being prevailing is to the extent that the leader has prevailed, the leader has survived, the leader has basically been elevated to where he is. This is what was with Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism might have started as a way of trying to get some cultural pride. Soon enough, it evolved from that to producing the Ba'ath. The Ba'ath produced Saddam, and Saddam produced the dictatorship and the terror and the death that we've seen across Iraq up until the fall of the regime. But again, the same pattern exactly. We're not talking here about an antithesis. We're talking about another production of the same pattern happened with Islamism. So again, instead of even irrespective of the fact that to start with, an Islamic political proposition is already exclusive of non-Muslims. But even then, even if we condone that unforgivable exclusion, we're still talking about a proposition that reduces the Muslim to just a peg in a unity that needs to be basically focused upon. And that unity has to be basically, it gets to be embodied by the organization, whether it's al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And then it's the survival of the leader and the survival of the leadership, at least, is what matters. So here we have, I'm proposing to you that when we talk about the need to challenge political culture in Iraq, is to move away from the reductionism that has basically produced what in Iraq has been in currency, in dominant currency throughout, to the notion of the state of its citizens, to the notion of basically valuing the individual. I'll probably get a little bit more into that, but what I need to talk about, in addition to that, there needs to be a renegotiation, a rediscussion of the place of Iraq in civilization. And I do not mean the place of Iraq in Islamic civilization. I do not mean the place of Iraq in Near Eastern civilization. I mean the place of Iraq in the global civilization that we have today. It is interesting to see that, for example, while in the West, very often there is the sense that the antiquity of Western civilization is Greek and Roman. For the Greeks themselves, and therefore for the Romans, who looked up to the Greek as their, if you like, a frame of reference or as their cultural origins. For the Greeks themselves, the frame of reference actually included Mesopotamia and Egypt. But in this case, let's focus on Mesopotamia. I mean, one can think, for example, of the Hellenistic period of Berosus in particular, and his highlighting of that. But even if we go beyond that, so the issue here is that it is not uncommon for intellectuals in the West to recognize that the seeds of Western civilization are in Sumeria, are in Mesopotamia. After all, semiotically, we are all still framed by this early Mesopotamian, early Sumerian norms, whether our hour, which is 60 minutes, or our week, 7 days, our zodiac, etc. Semiotically, we are framed, but beyond. I'm mentioning all of this just in order to say that there is a need in Iraq to reappropriate its own history, and it's happening. This is not a novel idea for Iraqis. I mean, mentioning here a lot of current Iraqi attempts at this, in this direction, not ones that seek to isolate in order to create internal narratives of dispute, meaning we are the descendants of X, while you, my Iraqi neighbor of another clan, sect, religion, you are not. No, I'm talking about what is clearly the case, an Iraq that has been part of a global civilization and needs to be restored in the minds, in the culture of Iraq today, even the political one, into that level. So here, meaning we can have, in terms of the themes that I'm mentioning, we can have two small, very quick case studies. One, a case study in reductionism. And you keep in mind the Iraqi flag of pre-1990, the flag of Iraq prior to the Gulf War, had 3 green stars in the middle of 3 stripes of red, white, and black. These are pan-Arab colors, and the 3 stripes date back to a certain, one of many attempts. I mean, they get to be reinterpreted all the time, but one of many attempts at Arab unity, again, in that push for reductionism. Well, in the course of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein added the 2 words, Allahu Akbar, to the flag with his own handwriting. And through multiple iterations that actually we can point to almost as kind of reducing the flag more and more, the flag of Iraq today still carries Saddam Hussein's religious words, Allahu Akbar, despite the fact that the stars have been removed, but the colors remain the same. I'm mentioning here that we have not been able to step out of this kind of the reductionist mindset that led to this flag. The missed opportunity in my mind, as a non-Iraqi, but as someone who looks with extensive love and admiration to Iraq, is the missed opportunity of the Rifat Shadiji flag. Rifat Shadiji is a renowned architect from Iraq who died recently, a thinker, a theorist really of not just of architecture, but of notions of culture. He proposed a flag that outraged many in Iraq. This flag is, in more ways than one, Rifat Shadiji's attempt at relinking Iraq, not just to its deep history and not limiting it to basically the phases of its history that have been called by the reductionists in the past phases, but I think the missing that opportunity is something to look at as an indication of how reductionism remains basically in Iraqi culture. And maybe it's also talking about the flag. I mean, I have here to note, Iraq has and had even more so a substantive Christian Iraqi population that evidently was at least not totally in comfort with the flag since Saddam added Allahu Akbar. This is what I find amazing, is that in some cases, this community, especially in church events, replaced Allahu Akbar by Allah Mahabba, God is love, which is a Christian statement, but nonetheless is kind of compatible with all religious tendencies, religious denominations in Iraq. I mean, the issue here, I'm mentioning it just to say that there is negotiation even with this reductionism that ought to be recognized. And this negotiation is in the direction of asserting Iraq as basically heir to a culture far larger than what the reductionists would like to see happen. So another case study, which is of extreme value, and I would suggest to you that it is a defining moment in current intellectual, in recent Iraqi intellectual history, is Kanan Makkiya's Republic of Fear. Here what we have for the first time, maybe not just in Iraq, but across Arab culture, is an attempt through this book that Kanan Makkiya published anonymously to start with. Actually, he took a pseudonym, actually, but later on clearly acknowledged it, is an attempt at trying to find the roots of self-destruction in oneself, as opposed to try to to assign the destruction that is suffered in society, in politics, in culture, to the other outside. Kanan Makia's book, The Republic of Fear, was an eye-opener for many Iraqis. Actually, it was published in the 80s, but it really shaped a generation of Iraqis that only today are beginning to assume a position of power. The generation before, which in some cases shared, in some cases disputed Kanan Makia's critique, auto-critique, self-critique of Iraq, is now apparently, hopefully, actually yielding to the new generation that looks at the matters from a perspective that is far less dogmatic and far less reductionist. The change, the cultural change that is needed, and this is part of the challenge that faces Mustafa al-Kadhimi in the next phase, is therefore not just one that is limited to notions of addressing the concrete challenges, but also in particular how to help transition Iraq from a set of elements of mindset that are really basically, if not destructive, at least obstacles to move forward elsewhere. What we're talking about is a transition from a mode of patriarchy to citizen sovereignty. I'll share with you here an anecdote, but it's, to me, it remained relevant throughout. I went to Iraq after the fall of the regime. A driver took me from Jordan to Baghdad, and we got to talk a lot. In the course of talking to him, he mentions to me, he says, yeah, I concede, I agree, Saddam Hussein was very harsh and was actually very unjust in many cases. However, he was a father. He was a harsh father, he was maybe an unjust father, but now we are without a father. This notion of patriarchy, this notion of thinking of the leadership, thinking of the political leadership as being the frame of reference in a family model, is actually dominant across the region. This is not limited to Iraq, it's not even limited to the region, but goes contrary to the whole notion of citizen sovereignty, that ultimately the prime minister, the president, is a public servant. He is not the father. And this transition from patriarchy to citizen sovereignty is one that is difficult, and it entails a lot. For example, what we currently have is part of the protests in Iraq is demands on the part of the university graduates to have employment. They want guaranteed employment. And here again, so in addition to patriarchy, basically having to move towards citizen sovereignty, moving from paternalism to a sense of entitlement towards this father figure to the state. So moving, I mean, from paternalism and this sense of entitlement to a culture of individualism and empowerment. Meaning the idea is that it's not just that the state is not father, the state is not mother. The state is not supposed to be the party that provides the employment. It is supposed to frame the conditions that allows you as an individual to basically innovate and create and be empowered to seek happiness, seek wealth, seek fulfillment. So this is a major cultural shift that remains actually work in progress at the very best. I'm glad to see that there are lots of Iraqis who are pushing in that direction, and among them actually the prime minister, but the bulk of the culture remains in the mode of that even if that were to happen later on, you cannot drop us midway. We need the employment now, and then let's work on changing the culture, which is a fair point. The third element that requires a serious reconsideration in political culture in Iraq is to transition from the perpetual sense of victimhood to a sense of self-responsibility. This is not at all, cannot be equated to basically promoting impunity or diluting accountability. These are two facets of the same pattern of progress. in Iraq, very often in Iraq, across the region, it is narratives of historical victimhood that dominate. But as a result, there's an avoidance of trying to address the issues at hand. And this is exactly, I think, what Kanan Makia has called for to face. And this is, I think he was on point. This is a question not just for Iraqi, for everyone in the region, the notion that self-responsibility and the responsibility of one's own society, one's own family, one's own heritage, one's own tradition to the situation that we're in need to be explored. And finally, another element that actually is crucially important for the Iraq of the future to work on is the whole notion of moving away from the logic that assume that because it's an frontier state, because we're getting funds basically from selling oil, it's a zero-sum game. If you get more, I get less. If Iraq basically transitions to a productive mindset and to a productive economy, well, we can start thinking about basically a win-win mindset that might end up helping Iraq position itself not where it should be as a leader in the Middle East, but also beyond that into to regain its place in the world community, a place of that it has been denied by dictatorship, by war, and by terrorism, and lately by Iranian hegemony. I'll stop at that, and Bob, I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you very much for that very illuminating talk. I know that your efforts in Iraq and Kanan Makia's were to fight Saddam nostalgia immediately after the fall of the regime, because of chaos obtained after the fall, and people were already becoming nostalgic. Therefore, that very powerful 1-hour television program that you produced, I think called Light or Overcoming the Legacy of Evil, had as part of it Steven Spielberg type interviews with victims of Saddam. And as you know, he was an equal opportunity persecutor. And the hope seemed to be that this enormous fund of suffering in Iraq that was across denomination, across tribal boundaries, would meld the Iraqi people and bring them together for this new endeavor, this new chance they had for a constitutional government. So it's disturbing to hear you say that Saddam nostalgia is still there. In a way, it reminds me of what we hear from Russia, that there's a great deal of Stalin nostalgia. In fact, it's reputedly exists amongst the majority of the Russian population. How big an obstacle is that to the endeavor that you have just outlined?
I think we ought to take it seriously, but we do not need to assume that is a long-lasting obstacle if dealt with appropriately. I mean, let me here underline the fact that very often it is not a real nostalgia. I mean, it's a false nostalgia in the sense it's always kind of selectively retrieving elements that can be presented in a good light and ignoring the major elements that are horrific. But it is not even this. Very often it is meant to be a provocative assault on another. By that I mean, for example, there is unfortunately a deep factionalism in some segments of Iraqi society, and therefore this factionalism is often the Saddam meme, if you'd like, is recycled in order to provoke, in order to insult, on the basis of by recalling the nemesis of the other rather than the hero of the self. Not that there are quite a few, whether they pretend to be nationalists in an Arab Iraqi sense, mind you, They may even pretend to be pan-Arab nationalists, but their concerns rarely go beyond the Iraqi horizon. But those may try to elevate Saddam into a figure of leadership, of historical leadership. But it's really mostly in terms of trying to deal with this false nostalgia. I think it's extremely important not to let that history of persecution, which is dramatically different from, if you like, your run-of-the-mill dictatorship, not to let it slide, not to let it be forgotten. But the issue here, and this is becomes, it's important to tie it to it. The horrors committed by the Saddam regime are actually have been continued after the fall of the regime by the horror committed by the Islamic State, and in some cases by reactions to the Islamic State. So one cannot simply talk about the period of dictatorship as if with its end we have witnessed the end of the horrors that Iraqis face. And therefore it's important, ultimately, the original impetus of trying to critically, self-critically address that period, it's important to revive it while not limiting it to that period, to include within it what has happened since. And I think this is the first time, again, without without here putting too much responsibility on the shoulders of a prime minister that's trying to, first of all, remedially lift Iraq from the many holes that it is in, but to address that whole issue, the fact that you have grievances of a cultural, historical type, in addition to grievances that are about suffering and deep suffering. I think this is why I'm suggesting to you that saving Iraq entails addressing it structurally, but also culturally.
Hassan, you know Mustafa al-Kadhimi very well. Could you speak to his background and personal qualities that may enable him to deal with and perhaps overcome what seem to be insurmountable difficulties?
Well, yeah, to the extent, without betraying any if you'd like, privacy issues here, but I'll tell you the following about him for sure. From my perspective, as someone who has known him, who has worked with him, and who actually prides myself on being a friend of his, I would say that this is a principled man who has sacrificed a lot to get where he is as Prime Minister of Iraq, while he did not need to be. He did not need to sacrifice. He did not, this is not, basically, he has never been part of that circle of kleptocrats. I mean, actually, I think he would challenge anyone to basically try to reveal any kind of corruption or anything associated with him. This is someone who starts with from a conservative background, gradually embraces a very, I would say, compatible combination of patriotism and universalism. I mean, this is someone who values Iraq above all, but does not ignore, quite the opposite, puts human rights and universal values as front and center of his vision of Iraq. And this is, I think, this is why I suggested in my remarks that he might constitute a paradigm shift in being a new prime minister in Iraq, because this is not just about a new generation. I mean, the generation of those who were young during the Iraq-Iran war and therefore witnessed it, but not as participants, witnessed it from the sides, and then were not in leadership positions in the course of the 90s, leading to the fall of the dictatorship, but who nonetheless participated to the extent that they could as foot soldiers, if you'd like, in that effort. Mustafa is one of those. So he has lived the Iraqi experience of being under a brutal dictatorship, of resisting that brutal dictatorship, but he was not affected by the ideological burdens that are faced by the generation that just passed, of having to accommodate, having to adjust, having to rework their ideological legacy in terms of the Iraq of today. He comes to Iraq, to the new Iraq with a fresh outlook that is very humanist, very universal, and therefore one can expect him in terms of personal capacities and personal qualities to do the right thing, to make the right choices. But it goes beyond the person, it goes beyond the individual. There's the limitation of what is possible, and it's basically the test for Mustafa is what comes next in terms of how he's going to be able to deal with the realities on the ground while remaining true to his principles.
And I guess part of the question, Hassan, is how appealing to the Iraqi people is that humanist perspective that Mustafa al-Kadhimi has.
I would say today the judgment of Mustafa is not on the basis of his, if you like, philosophy. It's on the basis of the steps that he takes. And a recent poll that I've had a look at indicate that contrary to what used to happen in the past, he has a solid majority, a two-thirds majority of people who approve of the steps that he has taken. But actually, I'm not sure about the methodology of this poll in terms of asking about philosophy, but I would suggest from just following Iraqi social media that that humanist, patriotic, universal kind of outlook, one that does not ignore Iraq at all, quite the opposite. Iraq is still front and center, but nonetheless, it is a universal framework, a global framework in terms of values, is shared by a large portion of those who protested the failure of the new Iraq in the form of these demonstrations that were targeted by Iranian proxies, and hundreds of protesters who were killed. And therefore, while they might not be happy with his ability to deliver, because Iraq is effectively bankrupt, and many of the protesters basically were demanding their fair share of the wealth that's no longer there. But despite the fact that indeed they are right, it is their fair share, but it is not with him for him to be able to dispense it. So they might not be happy with some of the measures that he takes, but nonetheless, I would say that this is the first time that we witness in Iraq, since the fall of the dictatorial regime, we witness a government that is actually understood by the society, that it is trying to engage in steps for the benefit of this society on the basis of a vision that is not factional, that is not sectarian, that is not kleptocratic.
You mentioned patriotism, and that was going to be my next question of how strong is it as a source upon which Mustafa al-Kadhimi can draw, keeping in mind those demonstrations in Basra and elsewhere that were directed against exactly the Iranian hegemony about which you spoke earlier.
Yeah.
Is that of sufficient strength that he can call upon it to achieve his ends?
It is positively an element that he can call upon, that my understanding he's calling upon, and absolutely he should rely on. But let's be clear about it. And this is important for a non-Iraqi audience, for a Western audience. There has been a narrative that has really become almost dogma in the Western media, even in Western scholarship at times, that Iraq is an artificial country that was put together back in the 100 years ago after the Great War, the First World War. And Iraq really is made of three major ethnic groups: Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds. And as a result, we have even politicians, including, if I'm not mistaken, Vice President Joe Biden, who have suggested, well, let's get done with it and divide Iraq to those three entities. And we have even witnessed, for example, a certain level of autonomy in Kurdistan of Iraq, and therefore even Kurdish nationalists have insisted that this is part of something bigger, because the Kurds were the largest national group that was ignored in the aftermath of the First World War. I'm not at all here dismissing the depth of Kurdish nationalism, a sense of Kurdish identity, quite the opposite. But I would suggest to you the following. These are multiple facets of a population across Iraq that has really a high degree of mingling. For example, among the Sunni Iraqis, you will find many of Kurdish origin. Among the Kurdish-speaking Iraqis, you would find clans and tribes of Arab tribal origin. Sunnis and Shias, the intermarriage rates prior to the war was at a point where basically we're talking in urban settings. Wherever they are together, that the intermarriage rate is such that it's really one community. So these are not realities fixed in stone to talk about Sunni, Shia, and Kurd. These are a reflection of an immediate history. While if you take the longer trends within Iraqi history, you can find basically threads that continue from the times of Sumer up until today. You see threads of behavior, of values, of patterns that are there. And therefore, we have here the possibility of really reviving, of highlighting the commonalities is there. I mean, the differences between the various communities in Iraq is really at the level of surface and ritual, not at the level of society. And I think many in Iraq today are not only aware of that, but are relying on that in order to tell those who have tried to box them in communitarian, sectarian, and factional entities that we are not you. I mean, too bad for you, your ideology took over your vision of the world. Our ideology is not yours. Our vision is one of basically nation in the patriotic sense, not in the folk sense, and humanity. And this is something that is seen throughout. This is without it being expressed the way I'm expressing it necessarily, although some have done a far better job expressing it. But this was the reason why, for many, to say, do not try to sell us that Shia bond between Iran and Iraq. We are Shia and proud to be, but we are not only Shia, and we are Iraqis, and we have far more in common with our Iraqi next door, whether Christian, Shia, Mandai, Shabak, whatever he is, than with Iranians. Not that we do not have connections with Iranians, we have plenty, but the connection that you're trying to promote is one with an Iranian regime, not with an Iranian population that is actually on a continuum basis with us. So we have a certain maturity at the level of the new generation that was not there really amongst ideologues. And yes, I mean, the new government of Iraq has to rely on it in order not just to highlight and enhance the sense of patriotism, but it's a patriotism that ought not in any way be one that looks at the other, whoever this other is, whether it's Iranian, Saudi, Israeli, Syrian, Turkish, as being basically the enemy. The enemy ought to be basically backwardness. The enemy ought to be poverty. The enemy ought to be the threats to the environment and the threats to world peace. The enemy ought to be the coronavirus. I did not even mention this, but clearly, except in mentioning the standard basically challenges. I mean, here we have COVID-19 also not having been felt in Iraq the way it could still get to be. But these are the real enemies. And I think there's a certain consciousness, a certain awareness at the level of the new Iraqi generation that ought to invite the older Iraqi generation that is more stuck on ideology to basically step aside and let the new generation own its present in order for it to own its future.
Hassan, your mention of Sumer spurred a painful memory about the first national newspaper that was begun in Iraq in 2003 after the fall of Saddam by that great dean of Iraqi journalism. Was it Hassan Alawi? Do you remember? It was called Sumer.
Yes, yes, yes.
It was brilliant.
Absolutely. And
It
actually,
was a brilliant newspaper that aimed to achieve that sense of national unity based exactly on the grounds that you have just articulated. And I remember Kanan Makia going to the Coalition Provisional Authority head to try to reverse his decision to shut that newspaper down. Unfortunately, he couldn't be dissuaded, and that was a lost opportunity. But not to dwell on that, I have another, like to close with a question raised by your very profound analysis of the cultural issues, the cultural framework. In the West, there was a similar period of patriarchal government, which was called the divine right of kings, in which the king presented himself as the father of his people, and his subjects were his children, and he was to exercise patriarchal authority over them. They could not disobey the father. The father was above the law he gave the children, etc. And then there was a secular expression of state absolutism in the teaching of Thomas Hobbes's famous book, Leviathan, that comports perfectly with what you were describing, that the individual does not exist as a person outside of his membership in the state. He's totally subsumed by the state. Now, in the West, luckily, there were older traditions in Christian political philosophy going back to the Middle Ages to fight these ideas that no, actually, the people are sovereign. Sovereignty is invested in them, not in this king, and there's a requirement for their consent and so forth. So after a period of struggle, we saw the development of democratic constitutional government. So that the question is, within Iraqi Islamic culture, are there traditions, older traditions to which they can turn to break this patriarchal notion, which, as you know, in fact, we haven't discussed to what extent that obtains in tribal life and to what extent the notion of tribal allegiance still obtains in Iraq today, that can break that notion of patriarchy and restore or give a sense of the popular sovereignty and of the individual's autonomy quite apart from state. That's a tough one. That would maybe another lecture.
I know. I have to count on you, Bob, to basically ask me a question in the closing minutes that require probably a series of discussion. But let me be clear about it. We have a situation today. I mean, clearly the trajectories of the evolution of, if you like, the relationship between church and state in the West and religious thought in the East. These are different tracks. I mean, they have not followed, if you like, they are not in parallel. They do not, there's no linear path here or there in order to be able to identify equivalence for some elements that basically enabled the Enlightenment in the West, okay? But I would submit to you the following, and this is crucially important, that the tradition, which is very much the scholastic tradition in Islam, is representative of the Islam of the scholars, of the Islam of the state. It may have been accepted in theory as representative of beyond by Muslims in their everyday life, but it was overwhelmingly not so in reality. What I'm pointing to here, again, this is a very wide subject, is that much of the concerns, much of the output of the scholastic tradition, of jurisprudence in the scholastic tradition and beyond jurisprudence, was how to deal with this overwhelming majority of Muslims that are not abiding to the vision that we have. You see, we do not have basically a theoretical formulation for that overwhelming majority that challenges the scholastic model, but we have a practical, overwhelming practical demonstration that the challenge was there throughout. I'm mentioning this just in order not to fall into the trap of basically assuming that if there has not been a formulation that basically highlights and focuses on the individual, therefore this is a missing link up until it happens, basically we are in a deficit. I would argue the following. The Enlightenment, when it reached ideas, let's hear again without, I'm schematizing clearly. When the Enlightenment reached the region, the scholastic institution was at an extreme unease, while the overwhelming majority of the population was not. Meaning these ideas were not necessarily expressed explicitly, but they were not unknown to them. This is what one can have a whole really analysis on the basis not just of text, but of movements, of manifestations that have happened throughout the region of how the ideas of the Enlightenment were not foreign to this region, not in their totality. I would argue up until today, are not completely assimilated. I would even argue that the intellectuals very often are many steps back compared to the general population in that regard. For example, conventional Islam, again, in a very, I'm stating it in a very wide way, conventional Islam tolerated a lot of internal contradictions, even at the scholastic level. And on the basis of these contradictions, allowed very little, if you like, harshness to be legalized. Not that harshness did not happen, harshness happened throughout, but not necessarily as normative. While the modern interpretations of Islam, which tries to basically get away with inconsistencies, with contradictions, whether in order to create a liberal Islam or a radical Islam, okay, basically have enabled, are in a pattern of reductionism. This is why I was saying that the notion, the need to challenge reductionism. Again, I'm in order, this is a very conversation that can take a lot of time, but just to underline the following. From my point of view, and from my point of view explicitly, and from the point of view of very many people, implicitly at least, is that they're not going to wait for the scholastic institution, for the religious scholars to transcend what they have abandoned, what they have not done in terms of finding those foundations. They do accept the authority of the religious authority as basically a frame of reference, but it is one frame of reference among many. Other frames of reference include the nation, the state, society, the world community. And therefore, when the frame of reference, which is the religious authority, even if they are cherished, even if they are basically privileged, but when they fail, society does not have to wait for them. We've seen that even in Iraq, for example, with regard to the outrage of the genocide of the Yazidis, genocide, enslavement, and collective rape of Yazidis. Where is the religious authority here? Not just in Iraq, across the Muslim world. Where are the religious scholars who have denounced that not as harmful to Islam, but as contrary to Islam? Non-existent. But does that mean that society is supposed to wait for these scholars to find the formula in order to graduate? No. Society says, well, on the basis of other norms, our common humanity, our basically adherence to values that are shared by everyone, we denounce it. And this is an act of self-liberation that people have implicitly taken. In a certain sense, this has been the challenge that the scholastic religious institutions across the region have faced, and that applies to Iraq. The Iraqi young people who transcend factionalism, sectarianism, communitarianism, without saying what I'm saying, are effectively saying it. And this is why it gives me and gives a lot of people a lot of hope to look at how we're talking about the maturity of a generation that has been in more ways than one shortchanged, because the previous generation has denied it a lot of what it's entitled to, but it is now ascending to a position of leadership. Let's hope for the best.
Hassan, thank you very much for that. You did answer that question and condensed a tremendous amount in it. Perhaps at another Westminster talk, I can entice you to expand upon that. Because at a certain point, there would have to be an articulation of some foundation for them to proceed upon if the changes they wish for are going to be permanent.
Yeah, it is here, but it's not necessarily religious.
No. Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that at all. So that's another program, and I hope I can get you back to Westminster without this, what it's been a 3 or 4 year hiatus. And Hassan, I can't thank you so much for joining us at Westminster Institute. And we hope to have you back again. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.